everybody, this is Falcon Napier. Welcome to the Circle of Brilliance. Today we're going to start a new topic, and that topic is spiral dynamics. And the question that we are hoping to answer is, does spiral dynamics overlay on the change grid? If so, how does it overlay? And assuming it overlays, does it add anything to our understanding of tension management and change management? Or do we actually add something to it? And so we want to figure out, where does this whole concept of spiral dynamics come into play? Now, I'll give a better introduction of the spiral dynamics model, I guess, in just a few minutes. But before I do that, I do want to remind you guys that there is at least one concept that we have studied in the past that when we integrate it onto the change grid, it ends up taking, I would have said, a cyclical form, but we could also view it as a bit of a spiral without making too much of a big leap. And so with that, I will throw the subject out to you guys and see what you can do with it. So all y'all unmute so you can kind of participate in this dialogue. But how many of you are familiar with the adult learning model that says that we go through 4 very distinct stages as we learn something? We go from being an unconscious incompetent to a conscious incompetent. Then we move into being a conscious competent, and ultimately end up as an unconscious competent. Have you guys all heard that before?
Right,
yep.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's always been presented as a linear model that basically you start off as an unconscious incompetent, some sort of awareness occurs, and now you're conscious of your incompetence, your inability to do something. So then you seek out the development of competency, and ultimately you get so good at delivering on those skills or whatever that you become an unconscious performer yet again. And so they've always depicted it like it's some sort of a linear kind of a thing, right? We've all heard this before. We've seen this before.
Yes.
So,
I've always felt something was missing from it, though.
Oh, okay. Well, I think you're correct. And Linda says, for some reason, I'm sharing the wrong screen. So let me just click here for a second. Okay, and now let me click on here again. Desktop 2, share. You guys should be seeing a change grid.
Yeah. Yes.
No, lovely. Technology decides to cooperate. Well, then you saw all those little color bands everywhere. That's spiral dynamics. And so, yeah, we'll get into that in just a jiffy there. Okay, so as Brian just noticed, something's missing. So Brian, tell me, what do you think is missing from that linear model of adult learning? Or anyone else, chime in. What do you think is missing when it comes to that linear representation of the adult learning model?
I think when I was introduced to it, it almost sounded as if that linear progression was just finality. Like, you know, the question that I asked, I think when I was introduced to it, was like, what happens after unconscious competency?
Yeah.
So like when you reach another threshold, where do you go from there?
Right. And where do you think you go?
I think you go back to the beginning.
So, okay, good. So you go from being an unconscious competent to what? To an unconscious
spiral represents. So like you go from unconscious competency, so now you go back to this idea that when you reach a threshold, that the competency that you had needs to be developed, and so you reach a new threshold where you go to being incompetent.
Okay, and what you're actually describing now is a cycle depiction. We'll add the spiral element in just a second, because you're saying, like, basically sooner or later an unconscious competent is going to become an unconscious incompetent yet again. Right. And what was the problem? The problem was they were unconscious, and so they didn't notice that something was happening that required a different sort of competency. So a new challenge had presented itself. And so we would say that, you know, as you move, you go from being, you know, unconscious to conscious again, because you realize, oh no, there is something that I'm incompetent around. And we go through this cycle again and again and again. So I'll throw this back to you guys. What do you guys think of this idea that it's really more of a cycle?
It is, but don't you think people get stuck along the way? I mean, this is the ideal growth model, but some people are unconscious and competent all their lives, don't you think?
Oh yeah. And I'll demonstrate that for you guys on the ChangeGrid. Well, actually, you're going to guess how it works on the ChangeGrid, but yeah, sooner or later we're going to see how does that simple concept now overlay on the ChangeGrid, because I do believe one of the things that overlaying the ChangeGrid on that adult learning model certainly does is that it contributes something to our understanding of the adult learning process, that it isn't linear. It doesn't have a starting point and an ending point.
Yeah.
It has a place where things might get initiated, but sooner or later, we're going to end up right back to the same spot that we started at. And so I think that that's going to be a really interesting thing to explore as we do our little play with all this.
And I think sometimes we take 2 steps forward and 1 back. So if you have somebody that becomes conscious, incompetent, you know, it's almost like ignorance is bliss. Now they're aware they're incompetent, so it can take a step backwards because they lose confidence. They're so aware they're inept. Do you know what I'm saying?
I absolutely know what you're saying. The question is, do all the rest of you guys understand what Edie just said?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah,
That makes sense to me, because when we were introduced to this, it was in neuroscience lab. And so what we're looking at was this idea that out of all the permutations in terms of our attention span of things we can focus on, the brain tends to capture only but a fraction of that in any given moment. And so there's something that draws our attention out, but that doesn't mean that we're competent of it just yet.
Right.
So there's a difference between knowing something and knowing about it.
Yeah.
And
Well,
again, you're always met with this in any given moment.
Right. And I think another way to kind of express that is that until we know something, we may not see what we don't know.
Exactly.
But as we learn more, we realize there are other gaps. There's more awareness that's being created about what we don't know as we move, you know, around there. And again, now we're in motion around the ChangeGrid. Now it's not just a static thing. So here's the gifted students question for all of you. I'm going to give you those 4 combinations again. So you got an unconscious incompetent, a conscious incompetent, a conscious competent, and an unconscious competent. In which quadrant do each of those 4 reside? Upgrade, outgrid, downgrade, ingrid. Which one goes where?
Well, the unconscious the unconscious competent would be down in apathy, down in the downgrade danger zone.
Okay, and tell us why you've chosen the downgrade quadrant for why the unconscious competent would end up being downgrade.
Well, your ability is obviously very high, and you don't perceive any challenge, and that's why you're unconscious.
All right. And so to just kind of spread out on what David has just said is that the ability scale maps to, is it consciousness or is it to competence? So ability maps to which one?
Competence,
competence, sure. And so the more ability I have, the more competence. So I could just easily change this word ability to competence. So, and then how does it then that conscious versus unconscious might map towards challenge, might map well with challenge?
Well, the more conscious you are, the perceived challenge is going to go higher.
Yeah, because we know ignorance is what?
Bliss.
Yeah.
Bliss. And so if I'm not aware of any challenge or threat in my environment, I'm going to perceive the challenge in that moment of being very low. And then as I become aware that there is something in my environment that is not as it could be, should be, would be, whatever, what happens to my perception of challenge? Now that I'm aware that there's something out there that
Challenge
wants
is
to
going
have
up.
me for lunch,
It would go up.
it's going to go up. Right.
Mhm.
So we could say that as consciousness increases, no, how about this? As challenge increases, the demand placed on our attention goes up because we perceive that as representing a potentially greater and greater, well, challenge is the word, but threat, problem, puzzle, whatever verb or whatever word you want to attach to whatever is actually going on contextually. All right, so David just said an unconscious competent is downgrid quadrant. Where's the other three? Go ahead and play with it. Where do they go?
So the unconscious incompetent must be in the opposite direction in terms of low challenge, low ability.
Low
So that in
would be which
Ingrid.
one? Which would be which one now?
the in grid,
Yes, but this would be which of your
the unconscious incompetent.
the unconscious incompetent is on the in-grid quadrant. And it has a musical moment attached with it. It goes dum da dum da dum da dum da dum. So they're just kind of like, they're just kind of like going through life. It's just, hey, it is what it is. So I don't really know anything, but I don't really need to know anything. So it's all there it is. Now it's a false sense of security, but nevertheless, there's that element going on here. So then what happens? What about the other two?
Well, the conscious competent has to be outgrid.
Right, because what's the conscious competent doing?
They're paying attention.
They're paying attention, right? They're learning what needs to be learned, doing whatever needs to be done. They're facing whatever that gap of incompetence really is so that they can, satisfy whatever tension is being triggered by all this. All right, so that leaves then the conscious incompetent is upgrid, right? So now think about this in your real life. So you're going through life, and you suddenly become aware that you don't know something you need to know. Well, that awareness moves your level of tension upgrade, but you don't have what it takes to handle whatever that situation may be. And so you at least try to do an inventory. Maybe you do, you just didn't realize it, but maybe you got to learn something, find something, get a new resource, whatever it is, something to increase. Again, we're talking about competency, but it really is, I think, described better as ability to handle whatever that is, to close that gap in perceived competence. And obviously you have to do it at a conscious level. It's something you're doing deliberately and intentionally and all those other things that happen outgrid. And if you look at the engagement rings, you've gone from being in the upgrid, you are pre-aware, and then you become hyper-aware of what's going on. And then that awareness ends up moving into some sort of an intention. The intention becomes a bit of engagement. The engagement ultimately leads to some sort of execution or completion of whatever you're engaged in doing. Okay, great. Now what happens? What happens? Your ability is now very high. What happens as you continue to, deal with that particular situation?
It just goes to the back.
On the next task.
Yeah, right. It just becomes another task. As Jane was just saying, it kind of moves to the back of our consciousness, move to the back burner of the stove, and sooner or later we can continue to do it and do it quite well, but we are doing it now more on autopilot, or it's just become a habit or a ritual or some institutionalized procedure, but it's happening more in the unconscious kind of level. Now, truly, to be totally unconscious, you'd have to be down at zero, and we're not suggesting that, but maybe there are some things that you guys do quite well without even having to be conscious. And I mean literally conscious, not just how do you differentiate true physical consciousness from being aware of something consciously?
Well, I always use the example of learning to drive. So, at first you don't know anything, you're unconsciously incompetent. And then as you get behind the wheel and you start to learn, it's really challenging, and you realize, wow, this is harder than it looks. And then gradually you move, it's like you move around the clock to where you're more competent. And by the time you get to unconscious competence, you get to work and you don't even remember what the drive was like.
Right, exactly. You're on autopilot unless something comes up that demands your attention. There you go. Okay, so this is really important that you guys can really, I think, understand how that maps to the change grid. Because you can use it in any of your discussions with your clients or even self-application. You got to kind of know, well, look, if I'm up grid, it's because I'm aware of something I cannot do. And if I'm out grid, I'm actively doing what is necessary to increase my competence, my ability to handle whatever it is that's going on. Or I'm in the process of actually doing the doing that needs to be done. But sooner or later, natural movement on the change grid is what direction?
Clockwise.
Well, downgrade, ultimately downgrade, but yes, clockwise. And you're going to end up, downgrid at a certain point in time. Maybe not all the way down to the danger zone of apathy, but maybe it's power apathy. And that now gets us then to the question about, is it a cycle or is it a spiral? So what would the difference there be? And that now gets to something that Brian said earlier on. When we start to deal with, we're going to say, issue A, version 1, we may find ourselves as having no ability whatsoever. And as we move into that conscious thing, we might go all the way up to this danger zone and go, oh my God, I'm absolutely powerless. And so we decide to have our defense mechanisms, our survival instincts triggered, and we're going to fight very aggressively, and then we're exhausted by it. But then we go into, what did I say, issue A, version 2. And now we're kind of going like, well, I'm a little bit more aware of it than that. And I don't have to go so far up grid, and I don't really need to go so far out grid. So do I have to go so far down grid? And then we go, well, how about version 3? Okay, no, now I'm fine tuning things. I'm fine tuning things as I go further and further around and around and around. Do I have to go all the way to the extreme every time I go around? Or can I have each subsequent trip around that educational process become a little bit more mid-grid? Can I move? Are you guys with me on that concept?
Yes, yes.
I think,
yep.
Yeah, it's a spiral, there's no doubt.
Yeah, that sounds like a spiral to me.
Yeah.
I think you can consciously move it into a spiral if you are aware of the fact that there's a conscious competence model that does exist. And so when you're because every time you get promoted to a higher level job, you're going to go back down out of the unconscious competence down into the unconscious incompetence. And if you are aware of that fact, then you can ask a lot of questions, open your mind, be aware that, there's a lot you don't know, and you just, ask, you proceed from that place. And I work with clients all the time with this model and in this exact situation. And so teaching them to be aware that every time you start something new, you're going to be back down there on the bottom. I've got a picture of this model. You'll be back down on the left-hand corner, not knowing what you don't know.
Yeah, yeah.
And to Jane's point, I think what was missing for me when I was first introduced to this is why. So like if you ask the question in terms of why you're doing what you're doing, AKA getting connected to purpose, meaning, those kinds of things, it's a spiral, because you're going to realize that question, there is no there to get to. There's not a finish line per se. And so it will take you deeper and deeper into things. And I think that's oftentimes what's missing. So like when people have like a to-do list, I was always trained to have a what matters most list. And that's uniquely different.
Tell us more about that.
Because what matters most is like, you really have to ask this question. So you have to go a little bit deeper than, okay, I'm doing this, but why am I doing it? what's the real net value perspective of it. By net value doesn't mean it's the most popular thing. It means it's the thing that creates the greatest for the greatest good. So it creates the greatest outcome for the greatest good. And so it has this both short-term immediacy impact, but also it positions the long term. And so you're trying to close that gap. And so that's a little bit different than just doing things and not getting any juice out of it. I learned this in Asian culture. So that's where this comes from. So it takes a long-term
yeah, well, it's interesting. It's interesting because what you've just described is something that Linda is currently reading about in one of her book groups. So, Linda, tell them about what you're reading.
Yeah, one of my friends, who's also a woman business owner, said that she read a book called "The One Thing."
Exactly. Yep.
And it's actually, it's a very simple read with a very powerful message. And very, once you finish the book, she says it's going to be easy to implement. Because I was halfway through and I was trying to do everything and things weren't working. And she said, you got to finish the book.
Okay. So, all right. So let's kind of think about this for just a second. What would make it take on a spiral shape as we work our way through different iterations of this learning process? And so I'll give you an example from my own learning. As most of you guys know, Linda and I speak enough French to get by. And we're part of a French club, and it's a very nice kind of thing. But when we find ourselves trying to watch a French movie, or we are trying to really have a conversation with a native French speaker, you quickly realize how inadequate your vocabulary is, your understanding of, forget formal vocabulary, the informal, normal ways that people actually speak that they never teach you in a regular French class. And so we're constantly being reminded about how incompetent we truly are. Okay, so I can tell you that the very first time I did that, I would have rated my ability as being a 0. And, you know, it didn't send me up into a panic state. I didn't get out here in a fight kind of a thing. So I don't necessarily think the spiral has to have its epicenter at the center of the change grid. I think it's going to be kind of like a relative sort of a thing. So for all I know, my spiral when it comes to language learning is confined entirely to this in-grid quadrant. So, and I know that's an advanced kind of concept to throw at people, but can you all appreciate that the center of the change grid does not necessarily have to be the center of every single thing that you're doing in life?
Yes.
Yeah. So it moves around, which I think turns the spiral into a tornado, but that's a different kind of thing to be looking at as we work our way through all this kind of stuff. So now, when I come back around, I can't say my ability is 0 anymore, can I? I speak enough French to get by. So I'm not going to say my ability is a 9, 10, or 11. No, 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 no. I have been humbled greatly. My ability might be a 4 or a 5. I know enough to either get into or out of trouble. So that's it. But my next time around, I got to say, no, I'm starting from a higher point on the ability axis, and then my spiral is going to continue. And so maybe we start off with a little, if you guys are looking at the screen, you see me spiraling around. Maybe I'm a tiny little tornado, and now my tornado keeps moving further and further out grid, tracking along the heart line until I get out here to a point where I'm really now have a very high level of ability or competency in speaking the language. And so I really can tackle those higher levels of challenge, you know, sorts of things. And then no doubt you're going to find out there's a whole tense you didn't even know existed. So, so can you guys kind of feel that we have to view this whole learning model as something that has a much greater dynamic quality than any simple static diagram could begin to describe?
Yeah, so it sounds like the difference between, I don't know if it exactly parallels, but it sounds like the difference between an open loop learning system and a closed loop learning system.
Yep.
That's right. I mean, I love this because it's it's the challenge that really pushes the spiral, you know, that as in all aspects of the change grid, it's a challenge that pushes the learning spiral. I'm curious to also think about what happens when you have, I mean, I think what happens is you end up down grid when you have a learning level that goes up and up and up, and then suddenly the challenge is just no longer there for whatever reason. You know, life happens.
Yeah, you actually achieve mastery. Is that your situation you're thinking?
Mastery, and then the challenge goes away for whatever reason. So you either, my question would be, do you end up in down grid or do you end up in grid again?
I would say you end up, well, I'll throw it to everyone else. Where do you think you end up? Where does mastery end up leaving you?
Downgrid.
Downgrid. If it's
Down.
truly mastery. On the other hand, if it's mastery in the moment, and it might be years down the road, but sooner or later you realize, oh no, things changed and I stopped paying attention. You could ultimately find yourself back in grid, but you know, there's no real awareness in grid. Even if you look at the engagement rings, we don't even have a word available to us in English to describe how would you label the awareness that exists before you are aware of something, even in its earliest stage? I said unaware, you know, clueless, oblivious. This is what you're where you really are, and then something makes you aware of it. Something has to trigger you to recognize you're not aware of whatever's going on. Otherwise, you could just go on through bliss. So that's a lot to say. I think that when you achieve true mastery, you really are downgrid, and you're going to deal with a lot of the dark side of being downgrid. So you could end up with depression and boredom and that feeling of being trapped in a velvet prison, underutilized, you know, retired in place. How do you describe someone who was an expert of the old way of doing things, but now they can't function in today's world? They're kind of like, I don't want to say an old whatever, but yeah, I know there's a word for that feeling when people have, I'm a whatever.
Dinosaur.
A dinosaur. Okay, I was hoping for something. All right, there you go. There you go.
It's
All right,
just, I've heard that before.
yeah, no, that would fit. But it's the idea about, you know, that's really great. In your day, you were great. That day's gone. And so I think that there's a lot of that emotional sort of stuff that could go on here. And certainly Brian and Jane could explain to us what's happening with the neurotransmitters when you find that there's no longer any kind of a challenge. Then is there any dopamine anymore? Is there any, you know, I don't know that there's anything in your bowl of neurotransmitter soup that's making you feel like you're vital and, you know, alive and whatever. So,
Yeah, it's probably there, but it's probably dormant, because when
yeah.
you look at mastery itself, and there's lots of research on this, mastery, again, true mastery doesn't have a finish line. Like in the Japanese culture, they call it shakunin. And it's really like being a master craftsman. And they look at that as a lifetime pursuit. So it's not just something that you just arrive at and then you're done. As in finality, you just keep going. Like there's always something more to learn.
Yeah.
Well, and also I would think that then you become innovative within, you know, that's where you become the artist, and
Exactly.
you are branching forward and growing forward in mastery.
I think you're absolutely right, because you remember when we said, where on the change grid does true artistic creativity live? And it lives in this expressive analytical subquadrant. Because think about that, for you to be a master of any art form, you have to know your stuff. Every art form has got its rules and its, you know, specific details, its techniques. There's a certain amount of understanding that you have to be able to do that art form at some professional level or at some noteworthy kind of level. So maybe you are down here, but now could the epicenter of your growth spiral be the center of the analytical quadrant? And now you're going like, no, I still want to find something to do that's expressive, or I'm driven to make something out of what I already know. So maybe my spiral continues, but it's all down grid now, because there's nothing I'm going to encounter that makes me go, I have no clue what's going on. Oh my goodness, I feel horribly upgraded and threatened. And so I've got to become, that just doesn't feel like that would happen to someone who's achieved that level of mastery around that particular art form. Yep. Okay. And I think the same thing is true. Let me throw it to you. I mean, two of you are physicians. Is this not the same thing that happens when you're looking at any kind of a professional, a profession that would define itself as being a practice of something? So a
Exactly.
practice of law, a practice of medicine. Well,
Yep.
you could learn everything you need to learn to pass the test, and fine, you'll be very handy if someone is in a basic need. But are you keeping up with the latest, greatest? Are you, no, you have to continue to go, no, there's still something to learn. Doesn't need to move me up into stress, but nevertheless, there's more growth that I can do inside of my quadrant of being an analytical.
Right. And I find those people, I haven't done any research on it, but they tend to be dissatisfied quite easily.
Yeah.
Because they just reach a point where they just, like you said, there's just no growth. And you look at like the medical field, physicians were trained as apprenticeship originally.
Oh yeah.
Like it was a true apprenticeship field. And so the way they train you now, trying to get everything in 4 years or 3 years, and then it's almost like they say lifelong learning, but that doesn't necessarily happen unless you're doing accreditations, that kind of thing.
Sure. Yep.
Well, and there's still an apprenticeship element in medical training, at least in the US, because you're constantly, you have attendings and you're making rounds and you go on rotations and,
Right.
all of that is hands-on apprenticeship type learning,
Yeah.
augmented by the science and scientific, journals and reading and all that.
Exactly.
Right.
All right, and so this again, it just helps us to further illustrate the two things I was hoping to illustrate, and that is that learning can take a spiral form, probably best takes a spiral form, but that the center of that spiral is not necessarily the center of the change grid. Okay, now that's going to be really important, because now I want to introduce you to the actual spiral dynamic model. And I will tell you, if you go onto YouTube and you just do a little search for spiral dynamics, or you go and Google spiral dynamics, you are going to find all kinds of resources. And some of these resources are so profoundly saturated in academia that you're just going to start reading and go like, I finished the sentence, I don't remember where it began. You're just kind of going like, this is an overwhelming amount of detail that some people have decided to take this model to. And so it becomes quite difficult to find a simple model, a simplified model to really understand what's going on. And so I continue my search for that, but I have come across a few things that I would like to share with you guys. Okay, so again, lots of you have joined the call. Do any of you have a specific background with spiral dynamics? Anybody trained, certified, went through a class, read a book?
Well, we studied it in graduate school, and I think one good book that makes it pretty accessible is Beck and Cohen's book, Spiral Dynamics.
Yeah, but I was thinking the same.
It's fairly old, but I mean, there's a huge community of practice on
What's the author's name?
Beck and Cohen, Cowan, 2 authors. But they split up now, and Beck is mainly the one who drives the community of practice. But there's some cool assessments and stuff that you can do and look at from an organizational perspective. Where's the gravity, the center of gravity in which level the center of gravity is in an organization or a community or a culture or a country.
Yeah, and so let's kind of build on that. Basically, spiral dynamics is a way of looking at the evolution of people's value system, and then in turn, how that value system impacts their attitudes, their beliefs, their behavior. and how they would then naturally progress. And so if you read the historical foundations of it, there is this belief that all individuals and all groups of individuals, ranging from a family up to a team, a department, a company, a culture, whatever, a whole, planetary species, will experience this spiral movement. And you can move both up the spiral and you can move down the spiral. And I'm going to show you what these different levels are that you might move through. Now, I will tell you, I haven't been able to find a JPEG that is large enough for me to share and have it be readable. So I'm just going to suggest that you guys do your own Google search and see if you can find any diagram that looks like this. It actually has to have this spiral in order for you to see what's going on. But basically, they're all, and there's lots of other depictions of it. So let me just kind of show you another little diagram I found.
Would you do me a favor? Because I can't read. I mean,
I can't read it.
No, I know. And but to search it, because I'd love to explore this further. Can you tell us what's on the bottom there, or what to
Well,
look?
that's one of the things I can't read, but it's a spiral dynamics model reprinted from the Never Ending Upward Quest.
Okay, because I know you showed us this before.
And it's something, it comes from an interview with Beck by Jessica somebody in some magazine from 2002. Yeah, and I couldn't make out what the URL was to even be able to go and see if I could find a better one. But I was able to find some of the things that it says. And by the way, lots and lots of people have created their own diagrams. So I don't want you to think there's some place that there's a sacred set of diagrams. In fact, one of the things that you'll learn as you start to research spiral dynamics is that among the people who are doing work in this on this model, there's a lot of, how do I want to put this? Contention. There's a lot of argument. There's even lawsuits involved about who owns what and who had the right to do what with what. And so you're going to find out there's a little bit of a hornet's nest as you start to look at the background. So it's all out there though, and it's interesting to look at. But I'm just going to share with you the little bit that I can share with you to do this. The spiral starts at the bottom and the spiral is quite tight. And this is the beige. Maybe I can slide this in. Is this one more readable? The words are a bit different, but you'll get the same essence of what's going on. I think you could read that a bit better. But when they're applying this to a society, they're saying that this beige level, now the whole emphasis, the values that governed your life were about survival, protection, procreation, and rest. And this is starting to be about 100,000 years ago. And this is all about the instinctive or the survivalistic memes. They're going to be talking about memes and all sorts of goodies as you go on. But then they said that as society was able to survive better, one of the things that it did was it would move up the spiral. And now this is about 50,000 years ago. This is where you start to become animistic and magical. Who knows? But this is about belonging, camaraderie, closeness, dependability, family. So people started to try to make connections. And then over the period of time, now go back 10,000 years ago, you evolved in this red kind of level, where now that you had these little families and these groups that were forming, what we wanted to do was to find a way to win. And so these groups became factions, and there was aggressiveness. This is, by the way, where kings and queens started to come into the reality of what was going on. So honor and ferocity and obedience, and so you were forming now more tribes, and these tribes could be at odds with one another. And so instant gratification was what was driving it. And then at a certain point in time, they said, like, well, we can't all operate that way. And so we need to move up in our little evolutionary spiral. And now the emphasis came to things like obeying certain sets of rules. And so this is where religion started coming into place to add some sort of a sense of boundaries to people's behavior and all that. So they would stop just attacking one another out of passion and dominance and all those sorts of things, and now go, no, 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 let's now conform, let's comply. And this is where values came into place about charity and chastity and thrift and piety and all these sorts of things. That was the blue level. I think the blue level was about 5,000 years ago. Then you would move up into the orange. And now this is where operating again, any higher level of the spiral keeps into play all the lower levels as well. So all of this is still underlying our behavior or whatever. But now we start to feel like inside of that structure, can we now go and find our own excellence? And so this is where there was a pursuit for, ambition, independence, money, motivation, professionalism, and a great many people in the world of spiral dynamics believes that this is where we are today. But there is this movement that's happening to move us to the next level, and that's altruism, appreciation, diversity, openness, mindfulness. They're describing that as being the communicative, what on earth is that? Egalitarian meme. They feel that this started about 150 years ago. We started seeing evidence of it. Now, these next two memes are considered second tier. They don't believe we're even starting there yet, but that's where people are heading. And they do believe there could be more than 8 of these levels. But until we reach the higher levels, we may not be able to see that there are even greater levels of development that we can go to. But the day will come, they believe, that reflection and simplicity, sincerity, congruence, approachability, agility, these kinds of things will be the values that govern the way our society operates. And that if we continue along that spiral, we should be able to reach the highest spiral dynamic currently identified. And that's where bliss and calmness and flow and peace and serenity, tranquility, transcendence, unity actually does exist. All right,
Wow.
so
Well, they
from
They
Yeah.
have identified a coral. The next meme is the coral meme. And I mean, from an individual perspective, people are moving into yellow and turquoise. And if you think about the warm colors are individualistic. Like the orange meme is entrepreneurship. And you think about companies like Microsoft and things like that fall into the orange meme, whereas the blue meme are, things like banks and IBM and these hierarchical organizations that tend to be more rigid.
Yep.
And they're a collective. The cool colors are the collective community related, as opposed to the warm colors are the more individualistic, driven by individuals.
Well,
Can
in
I
fact,
ask here, the author Frederick Laloux, who wrote Reinventing Organizations, and he talks about the teal model. Is anybody familiar with that?
I am, yeah. Yep.
Yeah, okay. It's an organization designers get involved in that. I mean, I'm curious, I haven't, it's been a while since I read it, but it probably is based on this model, is my guess.
Well, it is. In fact, it falls between the green and the turquoise. I don't know what happened to yellow, but in fact, I'm looking at this. Let me just slide it under the screen because there was another one. They're calling these altitudes of development, and they've changed the colors a bit. But they said that teal sees natural hierarchies. So instead of artificial hierarchy,
Yes.
there's natural hierarchies and systems of systems.
Systems thinking, systems
right,
model.
but existing as opposed to constructed.
Yes.
System. So it's really, if you think about it, it's also more of an appreciation of what the natural order of things are versus the I don't know how to really describe it, but
The mechanism, yeah, the mechanism.
well, you know,
Yeah.
humans started out, you know, we're just another biological critter infesting the planet.
Yeah,
You know, and so, yeah, we started out in very much a survival mode. We had no choice. But because humans are what humans are, we kind of moved our way up and up and up. In fact, sometimes Linda and I will be watching, right now we're watching Rain, which is the story of Mary Queen of Scots and how she became involved with France and all this sort of stuff. And we sometimes just pause it and kind of go like, people actually live this way? These were actually their value systems? These were the way they believed and operated? And the answer is yeah. Because today we look back on those behaviors and go, how primitive. But that's all they were, was primitive. And there was a whole other line of primitive behavior that came before them and one that came before them, all the way down to the most primitive that they are describing as being, well, beige most of the time. I don't know where infrared came into play, but dawning self-awareness.
Can I ask one more question on this? Do you have any idea, and I'd be curious to know, I mean, Lalou seems to take this across cultures. I'm wondering if this work is based mostly in Western civilization or if it's world.
No,
You know,
they
across.
say if you really read what's out there, well, first of all, you'll find that there are people in every camp you could describe with
Right.
their own viewpoint around this whole concept.
I'll bet.
But
Yeah.
generally they're saying, no, this has to be something that applies to all humans, but not
Okay.
all humans are in the same place on the spiral at the same time.
Right,
So
right.
even if we look at how different governments function or different countries function around the planet, we might say, for example, that the United States is very orange, and there are some people that are trying to move it up to green.
Yeah.
And we say that, where we could say that a country like North Korea is probably down where? At red? Dominance and impulse, obedience, et cetera,
Yeah.
et cetera. But the people of North Korea might actually be all the way down to beige.
Yeah.
You know, so they're saying you have to apply this dynamic. The dynamic will hold true,
Yes. Yes.
but it
Yes.
expresses itself differently when you are looking at that. Because, for example, I believe that inside of our orange society, we have a few turquoise people.
No, we have many. Yeah.
Yeah,
We have,
that have individually, they have evolved to all that. Unfortunately, if they want to go out there and interact with the rest of the world, guess what they have to be comfortable doing?
yeah.
They got to be comfortable sliding down that spiral a little bit just to do what needs to be done, and then find that way back to the place of their personal evolution. And again, this is all tied back to values. In fact, we're seeing the word meme is used a lot, but you'll also see V-meme. So yeah. Anyway, there's a lot of things on here that I think you might find interesting. This is how they were described in 1996, which I do believe was when the book was written. Not sure about that.
Graves was you see the Graves code. He was the one who came out with the theory, and I think Beck and Cohen are the ones that kind of popularized it and put the colors to it. So the Graves code had these letters and stuff like that, which was not quite as easy to grasp.
Right. Yeah, I remember the letters always. Yeah, don't mind me. I'm babbling while I'm trying to type, which is not a good thing to do. If I go just even to Wikipedia, they would say that Beck was initially developed it along with Christopher Cowan, Cowan, based on the emergent cyclical theory of Claire Graves.
Right.
Combined with memetics as proposed by Richard Dawkins, and then somehow Mihai Csikszentmihalyi got involved. But they're talking about that this really started the University of North Texas. All the way back to 1975 was when Beck and Graves first met. So, all right, so we're looking at something that certainly has happened completely in our lifetimes. but who knows how far back they went to actually get to what they were really looking for. And this, by the way, this is a screenshot, which you're looking at now. I don't know how readable it is, but this is a screenshot from the Wikipedia page itself. And these are all the first tier. They do still show the other two, the yellow and the turquoise. It's a separate little screenshot I took.
Do we happen to know the backgrounds of those people? Were they scientists? Were they social scientists? Were they psychologists?
Well, for many of them, there is a link in Wikipedia back to their own personal
Okay, I'll
page.
take a look. Yeah.
So
all right.
Beck is 1937, was a teacher, geopolitical advisor, and theorist focusing on applications of large-scale psychology.
Okay. So
Yeah, so he was a psychologist. He was
but a psychologist of a whole different, you know.
Yeah, and
color.
I think he's still around, still alive,
Okay.
although, you know, run the math. He's
He's
not a young one anymore. Okay, anyway, now the thing I want to kind of just draw to your attention is, are those original questions. So let me slide these out of way for just a second. I just want you to see the spiral diagram. Now, in order for you guys to understand what I'm about to ask you, I need you to visualize a proper spring. So a proper spring is a spiral, but every loop of that spiral is of the exact same dimensions, right? The radius of each ring never changes. It's a spring. So when I look at this diagram, I wonder if I'm looking at a spring, in which case what I believe is the case will not hold true when we move it onto the change grid. I need the spiral to take the shape of a cone.
I think that's how it's more envisioned.
As a cone.
As a cone.
Okay, because if they envision it as a cone, I am going to be bold enough as to say that their cone is upside down. So because as I'm looking at it this way, the tightest part of the cone, the tightest ring would be down here at survival, at beige. And the biggest, grandest, most, expansive part of the spiral is up at the top of it, turquoise, which they would consider right now to be the greatest level of evolution in our values. Okay, so let me just show you our original diagram again and see if you can tell me, why do I think the highest expression should be the smallest circle and should ultimately culminate in a single point? And down here where things are most primitive, it is the biggest circle.
That's,
Was the question why you think that?
Yeah, where do you think I've come to that thought process? So what happened in my thinking that made me come to the belief that the highest level of achievement would be a single point?
Well, I think that you're thinking of the center of the change grid should be the highest.
And so, because I think like in a primitive time, I can certainly see how people of that time period, because survival was their survival, protection, procreation, that it was very much very primitive. I can see how any threat might be perceived as an upgrade danger zone threat.
But if you look at, I hear what you're saying. I mean, the center of the grid is, as you move up, it reflects what's being stated there. But what I see is the expansion is around expansion of worldview and perspective. Is what I see as Jane knows this better obviously than I do, but she studied it more, but I'm just looking at it. I would think the broad spiral is about perspective, the broadest possible perspective, the broadest look. And I do not see the center of the change grid as violating that. I think what the center of the change grid does is, even though it's a speck on the grid, and it's when you enter that speck, it's a highly expansive world.
Exactly.
It doesn't have boundaries.
Right, and that's what where I wanted to bring today's little discussion to that when we're looking at a change grid, we are looking at something that we have constructed to fit into a rather confined space, whether that's a sheet of paper, whatever we can conceive of in our mind, whatever it is. But I know this, that the true change grid is one that fills the entire universe in all dimensions. And that means that what we might consider to be a single dot in the center of the change grid could actually be a whole planet larger than any of us are able to even conceive of.
Yes, I agree. That's
Yeah,
my
and so that's what, but that planet is a planet made entirely out of bliss, calmness, contentment, continuity, flow, peace, serenity, all these words that are associated with that turquoise level. The world is a single dynamic organism with its own collective mind.
it's the oneness.
The
It's the oneness.
self, exactly, the self is both distinct and blended part of the larger compassionate whole. So I'm trying to read these. Everything connects to everything else in ecological alignments. Energy and information permeates the total environment. They're saying the Earth's total environment, but the total environment. Holistic, intuitive thinking, and expansive, and I think it's cooperative actions are simply to be expected. That description to me is what the center of the change grid is all about.
Yes.
That's
And
fascinating to me because I think about the word religion itself literally mean bind, but their practices creates this division because everyone presumes they kind of, have the answer.
right.
But I think it's aspiring to do exactly what you read.
Yep.
Well, it's the difference between religion and spirituality. Religion.
Exactly.
Well, true. Yeah. Well, religion is a blue construct.
Yeah.
Right.
Restriction. Yeah.
And that's why one of the things people have been noticing is that religion compared to 100 years ago, we could say is disappearing. It's still very present, but compared to 100 years ago, 200 years ago, it's far less prevalent in people's daily lives than it was before. And or religion is being redefined, and how it expresses itself, what it includes, what it does, all that sort of stuff. It's part of the evolution, and so there's even some books that have been written about spiral dynamics that focuses entirely on how the concept of God changes as you move up, 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 up. So yeah, they're talking about more God as a construct than God as an entity. But however people described and positioned and empowered that God is certainly different back in primitive times where people were terrified by fire.
Yeah. The eye for an eye concept versus
exactly.
Testament versus
exactly.
The oneness.
And so I'm going to slide one more diagram in, and this is where I hope we can begin our conversations next time around, because here's the thing that until you get deep into spiral dynamics isn't explained, and that is, why am I moving in a spiral pattern? And as I stay even at a particular region like the blue or the orange or the green, I'm still in motion, but what am I moving through in order to get up to that spiral? And I found one very interesting diagram. I'm going to need to reduce its size a little bit. But this is the one where I went like, wait, this is backwards, because they're putting the beginning of it, the lowest level, in the center, and saying that we are moving further and further away from our center as we go through these different levels. So again, I challenge that. I think it's the other way around, but nevertheless,
yeah.
What I think is interesting is the quadrants they've chosen to represent, and this is how you move from I to it. I think though you go the other way around. I think the spiral goes counterclockwise. The spiral goes counterclockwise. From I, we go to we, to it, and you go around and around and around, up and up and up and up and up through their spiral. So I would like to see if these four quadrants in any way map to our quadrants, or map all the way back to this idea about the four stages of adult learning. Yeah. Is this interesting? Are you guys finding this?
Uh-huh.
Yeah,
Thought-provoking?
very interesting.
I will say to you that so far I don't know that it's all that practical, but I am reading that a lot of people have built full practices around nothing but spiral dynamics. So there must be some way they can monetize this, and whether it takes a form of consulting or whether the form of coaching, but I'll be very interested to see how it fits in.
It's practical to an anthropologist.
Well, there you go.
which is what I am. So it's practical, but could I make money out of it? Right now I can't. But yeah.
And so that's what I'm saying. Like, I love when I can go in the world of the merging of brilliance. I love that I can say, hey, this is legitimately brilliant. And because it's brilliant, we should be able to find some way that it resonates with what we already have or overlays on what we, somehow they should fit together. There's only one truth. And so I love the exercise of figuring out how that all goes together. But that doesn't mean that it becomes something that's going to be, practical in the work that we actually do.
Lalu has made, I mean, that's what he's made his consulting practice around.
Yeah.
Well, can if I can share a little bit about the practicality of it, it's very practical. It's very useful in organizational development.
Sure. Yeah.
In fact, back in particular, did a lot of work in South Africa with apartheid and all of that, because when you're looking at cultural, you look at cultures and what memes or which levels different societies and different cultures are in, and you are trying to integrate those or to help those function more appropriately. You have to understand where their thinking is,
Yes.
where their anchor is. So I was just looking on my thing for one of my assessments that I've used in organizations before, which is really a long time ago, and I can't find it. I'm gonna have to dig through some of my old hard drives or something and try to. But
this is fascinating to me, because what you just described, Jean, is that, this is based on, you said values, and I was just thinking, okay, well, culturally, different, countries have such different values.
Mm-hmm. Which may put them at a different level on that spiral dynamic pathway of evolution. I mean, I hate to say it, but I'm going to say it. Most people in one of these upper level of development, or whatever, I don't describe them, upper dynamic, would look at a culture like North Korea and describe them as being primitive.
Well, yeah. I mean, I know somebody who's written a book on that very topic, but I mean, I still think that if you look at somebody like Lalu, that is what he's done. He's taken a look at organization development and culture development, world systems development, and map this. Yeah.
Well, and two, the point about how it can become useful, I do see this, that if I can recognize that an organization is stuck in red, that I might say, how can I help them cultivate these blue kind of values? Or how can I cultivate
very useful.
or down. The question is that if they are in red, what level of permission or authority or whatever? I mean, because I've done enough consulting that I know sometimes the only way to fix a company is to get rid of the people at the top of it. So, because they're the culture, they're the source of the culture that's keeping people contained and restricted or whatever. So I can certainly see how I could use this to identify where someone is and where I might need to move them. But I guess what I'm saying is that I don't see yet where there is a specific skill set associated with working with spiral dynamics. I don't see where the technique part of it is. So right now, it feels very, very amazing when it comes to the description part. But remember, we say the ChangeGrid is three things. It is descriptive, it is predictive, and it is prescriptive. So that's what I'm looking for, and I haven't found anything yet. So
I would argue that where it exists, where this work exists, is primarily in Europe, but in organization design, which is my one of my fields. I mean, this is where people at the particularly more so Europe than American, because Europeans tend to think and move themselves in a way towards the green and yellow more readily.
Absolutely.
And so that's where you have it happening now is in combined fields, but it's in organization design, it's in higher, more combined kind of practices. It's not in any one field, but organization design that borrows from a whole range of these. And that's where, I mean, I know people are making a living doing it. I mean, right. I mean, I would love to be able to do that. And so that to me is a learning edge, but
right. And again, for me, the whole question is just like in ChangeWorks, we have upgrade and downgrade maneuvers. I'd like to know what the maneuvers are that someone who is fully trained in spiral dynamics and uses it as a central foundation of the work that they do. Are there also techniques that are unique to spiral dynamics? Or is it more of like a framework that just says, as we're trying to move from orange to green or from wherever to wherever, these are the kinds of things that we are trying to cultivate, and here's some techniques that we could do that. So for example, if I have a group that I'm trying to
that's what Lalu is doing.
Okay, well, that's what I need to research and find, the technique part of it. Because I can certainly see how if I have my own ulterior motives and I want to change a blue or orange world back into a red world, I'll bet there's some specific things I could do to move people down that spiral.
But that's the work that Lalu is doing with reinventing organizations. That's exactly what he's doing.
And spell his last name?
Laloux.
Okay, so French. Okay.
Well, you can see an example of people being moved back down into the red and purple spirals in the white supremacy, all of these QAnon and all that kind of stuff. They're purposely moving people down the spiral into the purple and magical thinking and,
Right. Well, in fact,
exactly what's happening.
I would argue that that's the basis for a lot of the culture wars we're facing right now is orange at the center and then people pushing at either end up in yellow and turquoise versus red and purple.
Yep. The battle between
fighting for that.
Right, moving people up the spiral versus down the spiral. And it can be done very powerfully through words. So let me share one last thing. I know we're way over time, so sorry about that for those of you that need to go do something.
Fascinating.
Feel free to go do it. Well, we'll pick this up on Tuesday, and hopefully you guys will add some time to do some digging around. But here's the thing I want to leave you with. I'm a big fan of science fiction, and I've been watching this show called The Expanse. I find The Expanse to be one of the most fascinating science fiction programs ever, because it is describing in great detail exactly what's going on elsewhere in our reality. But there's this one scene where this one character who is very much misunderstood, a great character, he says something about tribal behavior. And he said, when things are peaceful, tribes get bigger and bigger and bigger. And sooner or later, when total peace is achieved, it is all one tribe. But he said, whenever there is conflict, groups start to form. Tribes become smaller and smaller because in conflict, you cannot manage a large team. So the family, or the factions break into clans, and the clans break down into, smaller and smaller and smaller units, because you simply can't manage a big group in times of conflict.
Yes. That's why,
go ahead, David.
Would this spiral dynamics model make more sense if it was three-dimensional?
It is.
Yeah, they do depict it as three-dimensional as best as they really can. But what is your third dimension? What are you thinking is like? That is an interesting thing, because is it just time that is that third dimension? What makes the spiral go up? Because they would say time right now they're mapping it all to 10,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, 3,000 years.
It would have to be learning. I mean, it just learning and experience with more complexity. So the more complex your system, the broader the spiral, and the more it goes up, and the ability to deal with. So it's complexity theory that ties to this. And
Right.
Yep. Well, and then that goes back to this whole idea about the adult learning model.
Yeah.
So we're going to continue to go around and around and around. And by the way, I was looking for something else, and you know how you find things that when you're looking for something else. I found that at one point I described that as the center of the change grid becomes more and more of your reality, everything away from the center of the change grid just becomes the crust that you had to crunch your way through to get to the real essential.
That's a great way to say it. That's beautiful.
Yeah, so there you go. Okay, well, I'm glad you guys are enjoying this. So I'll go ahead and do the editing and put this up, and we'll continue the discussion on Tuesday. So try to do a little bit of digging around on your own, everybody. And again, what I still would love to see, and I'll research Lalou, I want to know the techniques, because I got to believe those techniques are going to be upgrid, outgrid, downgrid, ingrid, and PowerPoint maneuvers.
Yeah.
So let's see what those things are.
I put a link to some information on the
on the
level,
chat,
which is the coral meme that it hasn't really been fully described because it hasn't really fully awakened yet. So there's no description of it, but
yeah, I do like that they're using as their representation for the spiral, a seashell. That's really interesting.
Yeah, but when you think about it, and you think about I mean, this is a whole other conversation. Fibonacci's theory, you know, the golden ratio concept of being at the center of things. This is the depiction of life, which is that spiral concept. I don't know if you've ever studied Fibonacci.
Oh yeah, I'm all about Fibonacci, right?
Okay.
Yeah, in fact, I'm going to share something with you guys. I know this has now become very different than any call we've ever had, but if you go to YouTube, and I'll do it right now, and I'm going to see if I can find someone created a concerto based entirely on the Fibonacci sequence. And he assigns to each key a number, and then he simply plays it. And it's one of the most beautiful pieces of music I think I've ever heard.
I'd love to hear that. I mean, all of the cathedrals supposedly are built on the Fibonacci.
Designed, right, because it goes back to the golden ratio.
The golden ratio and Leonardo.
Here we go. Just one second. Let me open it up, and I'm going to chat over to you guys. Scott, I don't know if you can hear what it's saying, but
I can't.
Let me stop that. Okay, so I just chatted over to everybody the link to it. But if you just click on that,
I can't see it. I have a hard time with that.
Okay, it's in the chat window. If you just want to do your own search, the title of this video is Encoding the Fibonacci Sequence into Music.
Okay, thank you.
So for those of you who don't know what the Fibonacci sequence is, it's a numerical progression based on adding the numbers before it, and it starts with 0 and 1. So if you took 0 and added 1, the next number in the sequence would be 1. And then if you took that 1 and added the number before it in the sequence, which was also 1, you'd end up at 2. So the 2 and the 1 ends up becoming 3, and then the 3 and the 2 becomes a 5, and the 5 and the 3 becomes an 8, and it keeps growing and growing and growing to this Fibonacci sequence of numbers. And there's a great many things in nature that follow that sequence, like the little petals on a pine cone follow the Fibonacci sequence. So anyway, it's great fun. But if you listen to that, Encoding the Fibonacci Sequence into Music, it's a beautiful piece of music. Based on Fibonacci. Okay, all right, that's enough for now. Talk to you guys on Tuesday. Bye for now.
Bye, everybody. Bye.